I'm reading from two chapters of Nehemiah, chapters 11 and 12. There are 83 verses. There are about 220 names of very ordinary people whom God records because he used these people in extraordinary ways. I will read just a few selected portions from these two chapters. The text is on the screen. I would invite you to follow along as I read. Chapter 11, verse 1. Now the leaders of the people settled in Jerusalem. The rest of the people cast lots to bring one out of every 10 of them to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while the remaining 9 were to stay in their own towns. The people commended all who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. These are the provincial leaders who settled in Jerusalem. In verses 4 to 6, you have the descendants of Judah, some 468. In verses 7 through 9, you have the descendants of Benjamin, some 928 men. And then beginning in verses 10 to 14, you have the priest who settled in Jerusalem. Their numbers total 1,192. In verses 15 to 18, you have the Levites, 284 people. And then in verse 19, you have the gatekeepers, that is the temple police, 172 men. And then we realize that the rest of the Israelites stayed in the surrounding towns and villages outside Jerusalem. At the beginning of chapter 12, you have another long list of names. And then in verse 27, we come to the dedication of the wall, and it is a great celebration. We begin reading in chapter 12, verse 27. At the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, the Levites were sought out from where they lived and were brought to Jerusalem to celebrate joyfully the dedication with songs of thanksgiving and with the music of cymbals, harps, and lyres. The musicians also were brought together from the region around Jerusalem. Skipping down to verse 31, I had the leaders of Judah go up on top of the wall. I also assigned 2 large choirs to give thanks. One was to proceed on the top of the wall to the right, toward the dung gates. Verse 38, the second choir proceeded in the opposite direction. I followed them on top of the wall, together with half of the people. Skipping down to verse 40, the 2 choirs that gave thanks then took their places in the house of God. So did I, together with half the officials. And then concluding with verse 43, and on that day they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing, because God had given them great joy. The women and the children also rejoiced. The sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard far away. On a hot August day in 1977, Julius Lowe died. He was not the only American to die that day. There were 5,478 to be exact. Some years before his death, his son Jules asked him in irreverent jest, Pop, tell me something you've done you're proud of that no one else has done, because someday I'm going to write your obituary. Mr. Lowe responded, I've turned in 3 fire alarms, none false. Some years later, writing of his father's death for the Chicago's Sun-Times, an older, wiser, sadder son penned these words. In his own time, this man survived the Depression barely, not to mention 4 wars and other assorted upheavals of 3 generations, and all the while kept both his family and his sense of humor intact. That son who once asked you what you were proud of, Pop, is in his sorrow awfully proud to bear your name. And then speaking not only of his dad, but for all the other handful of people for all the others except a handful of people who died on that same day, Jules Lowe wrote, "They were born, lived decently and justly, turned in no false alarms, worked hard, honored their spouses, begat children, and saw to their upbringing, minding their own business, and died without debt." By this world's standards, Julius Lowe was an ordinary man, a nobody noticed. But to his son Jules, he was a somebody needed. An ordinary hero, if you like. In Nehemiah's memoirs this morning, drawn from chapters 11 and 12, we encounter the names of those I call ordinary heroes. This morning, I want to introduce you to some of these people and then show you what it takes to turn insignificant nobodies into life-altering somebodies, ordinary heroes. Here then are three characteristics of ordinary heroes. First, ordinary heroes have a theology of place. Ordinary heroes have a theology of place. They believe they can make a difference where they live. Since the days of the Babylonian captivity, Jerusalem had been sorely neglected. For 140 years, she had been little more than a dumping ground for all kinds of junk. Her occupants, largely priests and Levites, were few, and hence the city was easy prey for marauding animals and hostile enemies. Most of the Jews who had returned 100 years earlier under Zerubbabel, see the book of Ezra, instead of locating in the city, had chosen to locate in the towns and villages surrounding Jerusalem, that is, on the property that their ancestors had owned. But with the walls of the city of Jerusalem now rebuilt, Jerusalem was about to be occupied. To accomplish the repopulation of the city, Nehemiah embraced two policies. The first was a policy of conscription. Note the words in verse 1, casting of lots. By this one act, 1 out of every 10 Jews living in the towns and villages surrounding Jerusalem were asked to move into the city. The second policy was not that of conscription, but that of volunteerism. Those untouched by the draft were given opportunity to move into Jerusalem as well. What follows in verses 3 through 36 is a public accounting of those people, draftees and volunteers, who ended up repopulating the city of Jerusalem. In verses 4 to 6, you have the descendants of Judah. In verses 7 to 9, the descendants of Benjamin. In verses 10 to 14, the priest. In verses 15 to 18, the Levites. And in verse 19, you have the temple guards, that is, the police, the gatekeepers. And then in verses 20 to 36, you have all the rest of the residents of Judah who stayed in the villages and towns outside the city. Lest you think that every Jew moved into the city, Nehemiah reminds us that a large segment of the population chose to live in the surrounding towns on their ancestral property. Now, what I want you to notice about the people who repopulate the city of Jerusalem are two things. Here's the first. They believed that the place of God's choosing was the place of God's blessing. They believed that the place of God's choosing was the place of God's blessing. That, I think, is the great lesson of Nehemiah chapter 11. In Genesis 12, God reminds Abram of the same truth. You remember what he said? The Lord said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to a land that I will show you. There, I will make you into a great nation. I will make your name great, and through you, all peoples of the earth will be blessed." It's true, isn't it? For Abraham, the place of God's choosing was the place of God's blessing. It's the same with Jesus. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he cried out, "Father, if it is possible, will you allow me to escape this cup that has come upon me? Yet not what I will, but what you will." That very night, Jesus was arrested. The next day, he was crucified. But notice when it came to the cross, he went willingly, not screaming and kicking. Why? Because like Abraham and Nehemiah, Jesus was convinced that the place of God's choosing was the place of God's blessing. Listen to the way Paul describes it in Philippians 2. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient, even to death on the cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him a name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, and every tongue proclaim or confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God. The place of God's choosing is the place of God's blessing. But there's a second lesson I want you to grasp here regarding a theology of place. Not only did these people believe that the place of God's choosing was the place of God's blessing, they also really believed, that they could make a difference where they lived. They didn't move into Jerusalem because they wanted to. They moved because God asked them to. They didn't move because they felt life would be easier. They moved because they believed they could make a difference in the city to which God had called them to live. For most of us, Glencroft is our last stop on planet Earth. It's the last place we'll live before we enter eternity. Do you believe you can be a difference maker at this stage in your life on this campus? Or have you given up hopes of ever again making a contribution to the place where you reside? Ordinary heroes, regardless of how old they are, have a theology of place. They believe that the place of God's choosing is the place of God's blessing. And because of that, they believe that they can make a difference where they live. But there's something else I want you to see in these two chapters. Ordinary heroes not only have a theology of place, they have a theology of history. A theology of history. They believe that their lives had been dramatically affected by the saints before them. What we have in the opening verse of chapter 12 is a flashback to a period 100 years earlier when the Jews came from captivity in Persia and Babylon back to the land of Judah under Zerubbabel and under Joshua, his sidekick, the high priest. Now, Zerubbabel, who preceded Nehemiah by 100 years, was Judah's first governor following the captivity. And Joshua was Israel's high priest. In the first 9 verses, we have in the verses that follow, we have 2 chronological listings. In verses 1 to 9, Nehemiah lists the priests and Levites who served during Zerubbabel's governorship. And then in verses 10 to 26, he traces the priests and Levites who served between Zerubbabel's leadership right up until the time of Nehemiah's governorship. Why this listing of priests and Levites who served Israel from the days of Zerubbabel right up to the days of Nehemiah? Because without their commitment to the city, Jerusalem would have been a virtual ghost town when Nehemiah arrived. We learn from Ezra 3 that soon after arriving in the city, Zerubbabel, Joshua, and his attendants took up residence in the city. For 100 years, while the city itself lay in ruins, these priests and Levites refused to abandon the city. Now, what's the lesson God wants us to grasp from this listing of names in Nehemiah 12? Nehemiah, in my estimation, is reminding us that ordinary heroes have a theology of history. They really believe, that their lives have been dramatically affected by the saints before them. Had it not been for these people listed in these verses, Jerusalem might have passed into oblivion. Not only did these priestly families repair the sacred altar, they laid the foundation and began the rebuilding of the temple. They believed that God had a future for Jerusalem, and they acted on that future. Do you have a theology of history? Have you ever stopped to consider how your life has been dramatically affected by the people who preceded you? When I look back over my own life, I owe a debt of gratitude to a man whose names will never be written down in the annals of church history. He was an American Sunday school union teacher who served primarily in rural areas in the northwest of our country. He pastored for a short time a little church in Seattle, Washington, where I grew up. It was a church my mother attended. I don't think Roy Kelstrup ever went to seminary. I don't even know if he ever graduated from the university. He was not a learned man, but he was a godly man. One summer, when I was home from the university, he invited me to preach on a Sunday evening, and I did. And when that sermon had come to a conclusion, he said to me, a business major, "Joel, I think you ought to consider whether or not God has a role for you in full-time vocational ministry." A huge part of who I am today can be traced back to that one man who saw something in me I didn't see in myself. He envisioned a new future for me, believed in me, and prayed that I would be open to God's calling on my life. I would imagine that if you were to take a moment right now and look back over your life, you too would call to mind a name or names of people who played a significant role in your life. I think of Grant Hendrickson, Grant Howard, Ray Stedman, John Stott, Charles Ryrie, Howie Hendricks, all men who helped shape me into the likeness of God. I want you to take just a moment, think about some of those names, and I want you to call them out. We'll have a cacophony of sound across our auditorium, but will you boldly and not shyly name those people, the saints before you, who've dramatically affected your lives? Let's go. Call them out. We could probably be for a long time naming those people. Ordinary heroes have a theology of history. They believe that their lives have been dramatically affected by the saints before them. There's one last truth I want you to grasp. Here it is. Ordinary heroes not only have a theology of place and a theology of history, ordinary heroes have a theology of celebration. I don't know about you, but I love weddings. Now, my friends tell me that if you really want to celebrate, don't go to a Baptist wedding. Go to a Jewish wedding, because the Jewish people really know how to celebrate. To them, celebration is a big deal. So as these Jews come to dedicate the wall they have just completed, they break out in a celebration of joyous worship. Worship that, as we shall see, will become an instrument for effective witness. Ordinary heroes have a theology of celebration. They believe that joyous worship can be an instrument for effective witness. Now, as we look at the remainder of Nehemiah 12, I want you to note three things about their worship. First, their worship was marked by great music. Look at verse 27. At the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, the Levites were sought out from where they lived and were brought to Jerusalem to celebrate joyfully the dedication with songs of thanksgiving and with the music of cymbals, harps, and lyres. You've heard me say it before. When we are normal, we talk. When we are dying, we whisper. But when there is something so deep within us we cannot contain it, we sing. Worship is marked by great music. Second, their worship was marked by great preparation. Look at verse 30. When the priests and Levites had purified themselves ceremonially, they purified the people, the gates, and the walls. The Puritan George Swinnock used to talk about having the oven of your heart warmed on Saturday night in preparation for worship on Sunday morning. Here's the way he wrote of it. If you go to bed on Saturday night, having taken some time to reflect on who God is, when it comes to Sunday morning, the oven of your heart, having been baked overnight, will easily be kindled the next morning. How many of you spent time last night or early this morning contemplating the majesty of God and preparing to enter into his presence? Third, their worship was marked by great joy. God-inspired joy. Look at verse 43, and note how many times the word joy or rejoicing occurs in this verse. On that day they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing, because God had given them great joy. The women and children also rejoiced. The sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard far away. I love that last phrase. The sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard far away. Some years ago, Tommy Coombs and other members of the secular rock band Love Song walked off one of California's psychedelic streets into a worship service at Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa, California. Lonely, depressed, and disillusioned about life, they saw something they wanted. Years later, Tommy talked about what he had discovered in that first worship experience. I quote, "What was going on in this little church was nothing like what was going on in the streets, but I sensed God was there. I saw their worship. I saw their love for each other, and I said, I want that." In that moment, God touched Tommy Coombs. Make no mistake, ordinary heroes have a theology of celebration. They really believe that joyous worship, or might I say better, a joyous life, is a tool, an instrument God uses for effective witness. Philip Yancey is one of the great writers of our day. In his career as a journalist, he has interviewed a wide variety of people, whom he divides roughly into two groups. He calls them stars and saints. I call them the famous and the ordinary. About stars, NFL greats, famous authors, TV personalities, he writes sympathetically. He says, "These idols are as miserable a group of people as I have ever met. They appear to have more troubled marriages, more tormented psyches, and more incurable self-doubts than most. About servants, on the other hand, relief workers in Bangladesh, PhDs located in the jungles of South America, translating the Bible into some obscure language. He writes with envy and longing. Here's what he says. I was prepared to honor and admire these servants, to uphold them as inspiring examples. I was not, however, prepared to envy them. But as I now reflect on these two groups, stars and servants, the servants clearly emerge as the favored ones, the graced ones. They worked for low pay, long hours, and no applause, wasting their talents among the poor and uneducated, but somehow in the process of losing their lives, they have discovered what life is all about. Jesus is not looking for superstars. He is looking for ordinary people like you and me, whom he can use in extraordinary ways.